Okay, thanks to see you joining online. And so we've got a pretty full room in here too, which is really great. So thanks everyone for joining us for this seminar this evening. Um, it's a real pleasure to have Michael Puma join us from Columbia University. So Michael is currently serves as the professor of climate and the director of the Center for Climate Systems Research as part of the Columbia Climate School at Columbia University, of course, which is co-located with the NASA Goddard Institute of Space Studies. The center comprises over 40, although I'm told declining, scientists and staff, and collaborates closely with NASA on climate science, exoplanet research, and climate impact studies. And Michael has secured funding from various institutions, including NASA, the National Science Foundation, the European Commission, the US Department of Defense, DARPA, and the United Nations Development Programme. And it's a real pleasure to introduce Michael for his talk, Hidden Correlations and Systemic Risk in Global Food System Vulnerability.
And thanks so much. Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here. Um, that was our home. That was the NASA Goddard for Space Studies up until May of this year, and we were given a month to vacate when that NASA decided to close our office, and we are homeless at the moment. So um, it is a tricky time at the moment for us. The main work here is developing a climate model. We had some exoplanet research and some satellite work. But yeah, that's up in the air right now. And we gathered in the various places around New York City. But this was a historic building, Collins Restaurant, is famous from the Seinfeld, US TV show Seinfeld. And before that, the Susan Vega song, Tom's Diner. But Susan Vega showed up at our last day, so it was kind of neat to see her, and she sang her song in a bar nearby campus. But yeah, so what I'll talk about today is work I've been doing with many colleagues for a number of years, and trying to understand systemic risk in global food systems and vulnerabilities, and how we can deal with this systemic risk and come up with strategies to deal with these challenges that we face. Uh, and with a particular focus, just because of our workshop on volcanic eruptions, and these are possible links. I mean, they're not. It's difficult to date a lot of these eruptions, and then the subsequent or the famines that are likely timed or around similar times. But we do know that a lot of the eruption was associated with famines globally. Some going farther back, we don't know so well. Tambora, of course, was the year without a summer of 1860. Um, and so yeah, various eruptions that we know are disruptions to our climate system, and we know agriculture is quite sensitive, right? It's difficult, especially going back in time. Agricultural systems were vulnerable, but we could argue that today our agricultural systems are vulnerable, but just in different ways. We have different dependencies on energy production and fertilizers, etc. But what I always I'm always struck by this quote, and from this compilation, Bad Year Economics from 1989. And they said, well, hazards such as dormant volcanoes may operate as limiting factors so rarely that they can be ignored by human populations. Such hazards can be and regrettably are coped with by the ability of human fertility to compensate for occasional catastrophic mortality. So that's a very dark and grim way of thinking about these things. Uh, we have the capabilities that, at least not to prevent such catastrophic events, but to at least mitigate the impact. And it is our responsibility to do that. And so I always frustrated by this, and I think it's important to push back. Is that's why we do what we do. Uh, one of the major historical famines, which may or may not be linked to the Tarawera eruption, which was, and people in the room might know better than me, but the date estimate of that. If it did occur in 1314, then it would have been a contributing factor to the Great Famine of 1315 to 1322, which was multiple years of extreme rainfall in Europe, mostly northern Europe, and it led to significant famine deaths. So this is a estimate from a Palmer Drought Severity Index for a tree ring reconstruction, the Old World Drought Atlas. Actually, we have colleagues at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory who have contributed to this data set. So this is areas in green are areas with very wet conditions. And so it wasn't 1 year, but it was multiple years of extreme wetness. And there's a possibility that that was the climate system, the dynamics were shifted by an eruption. But even if not, it's a concern. Like extreme events, especially when they're multi-year, have major impacts on our food systems. So I'm working with Francis Ludlow at Trinity College Dublin, and they had actually by Bruce Campbell, who's a world-renowned expert on the Great Famine, and he made an important point when he visited Trinity College. He said perhaps the Great Famine should be viewed as a catastrophic event arising from the complex interplay between environmental, biophysical factors and human societal elements, rather than solely on ecological or sociological phenomenon. So this is a key point. It's a great point because even whatever the climate disruption, there will always be some sociological, economic, or technological component to it. So it doesn't happen in a vacuum, and we could have very different outcomes for the same type of event. So this is both historically and present day. So it's important to understand our food system and its dependencies on other systems. And Amartya Sen, who is one of the most well-known famine scholars, he made this point in 1989, actually coincidentally the same year the other compilation, that blaming nature can of course be very consoling and comforting. Comfortable inaction is, however, purchased at a very heavy price, a price that is paid by others, often with their lives. There is no real evidence to doubt that all famines in the modern world are preventable by human action. Maybe that's a strong statement, right? I mean, one can imagine there's some climate shock or climate extreme that is not preventable. However, I think we can, again, coming back to my original point, we can mitigate the impact or reduce risk in our system. He's making a stronger statement that, well, we can actually prevent famine by appropriate human action, appropriate governance, and whatnot. But at the very least, it's important to recognize that the responsibility is on us as scholars looking at risk, on the responsibility on governments, the responsibility on many actors in society to prevent famine and to deal with that. And I think another from the 20th century, many of the 20th century famines were linked with government failure, and so some very different perspectives on the Great Chinese Famine. But what the point I wanted to make was that initially the Chinese government blamed the natural disaster for the Great Famine. They said a severe drought caused the catastrophic famine. But the reality is that it was their policies, forced collectivization, unrealistic agricultural quotas, shift of labor from agriculture to steel production, and this all drastically affected food availability. And this was certainly in recorded history the worst famine. From estimates range widely, but from 15 to 46 million deaths, making it one of the deadliest famines. So this is not to discount the role of the environment and climate extremes, but to recognize there is that interplay. And then we have to be aware of that. And we see that even today, from South Sudan to Gaza to Somalia to Yemen. These are places where we have the risk of famine, and it's intertwined with conflict, failed governance, and political issues. So famine, food insecurity, and the interplay with the environment are very, very difficult topics that we have to grapple with. So I think it's useful in this context to think about two types of food crises. Um, just to sort of, there's a standard four pillars of food insecurity. But I think just to simplify our story for today, we can focus on two types of food crises. One is an access crisis where people can't, food exists, but people can't get it. So it's not there's a lack of supply, but it's access. So either food's not affordable, supply chains are disrupted, so it can't reach people, and distributions fail. So that access issue. And the other category that we just consider for today is production and crisis, where you actually have food shortfall. So I think that's relevant if we're talking about these large weather or climate anomalies due to volcanic eruptions. So in that case, we would think about crop failure, livestock impacts. Just basically, there's not enough food, whether local and or global. But both can obviously disappoint. They can occur simultaneously, but they require different responses. And so understanding the actual situation is essential. And then also, it's important in terms of if we're analyzing our systems quantitatively with computer models that we understand which type of risk we're dealing with. So I'm going to show you today some examples for both, and then also something that's very preliminary, but something I'm working on. It's sort of a early warning metric that's I think is. I didn't intend to sort of investigate this, but it came as part of another idea on trying to work on decision making in this complex food systems that we came across one promising metric that is I think interesting. We'll see where it goes. But first, let me start with sort of a access crisis, and this is work with the Potsdam Institute for Climate Research, PIC. So Christianata worked with him for many years, and a postdoc working with him, Kilian Kula. They're doing great work. They've put together. We worked together to put together scenarios for the Ukraine war, and for sure. And so I'm using this as an example, right? Example of an access crisis. In this case, it's due to conflict, but you can certainly have a analogous type situation because of an environmental disruption. And this was, I believe this was from IPRI, David Latorre, but I should say that in the French way, and I don't know how to pronounce it the proper way. But we can see that there's a huge dependency globally, both on Ukraine and Russia for major crops. So from wheat, sunflower, maize, barley, sunflower oil. These two countries are very critical to our global food system. And the other story when the Ukraine war broke out was fertilizer. And it turns out that this fertilizer is really irreplaceable. And hence we haven't seen sort of sanctions limiting the exports of these fertilizers, because we see the high dependency of, European Union, but also relatively food insecure countries in Africa that would have no other option. So there's a high dependency on these two regions. And this was for potassium fertilizer. So these are imports by country. So huge percentage shows that they're totally dependent upon Russia and Belarus in the countries in the dark red. Uh, and these are often, sort of mineral fertilizers. So it's something, if you don't have those resources, you can't replace these imports. So what we did, we did a study with a model that's sort of skillful at modeling short-term disruptions to global commodity prices and stocks, takes into stocks. Um, and what was clear in this case, that international cooperation really stabilized wheat prices after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Um, and my view is that there's sort of a learning experience from the food price spike in 2007, 2008, 2010, 2011, where we see food prices spike. People start to realize systemic risk in the food system. And so there was really concerted effort to avoid shutting off trade, both from Russia and Ukraine. So there was the effort to continue the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Initially, that protected a number of ships leaving the Black Sea. That subsequently failed. However, we still see transport of grain out of the Black Sea. Part of it's by a shadow fleet that's not really tracked. They turn off their transponders. But I don't think anyone really has interest in shutting off the flow of fertilizers and food supply from the region, right? This is clearly going to cause shortages and instability in the global food system. So the war continues, and the flow of food and fertilizer out of the region continues, which is it's a strange situation, to say the least. And besides that, when the war was starting, there was also this effort to have transportation of food out of the western border of Ukraine, which probably many of you are familiar, that led to some challenging situations in the bordering countries of Ukraine in terms of disrupting their markets in those regions. But long story short, the factual, the challenging part of this is, so prices declined relative to the average prices from 2000 to 2020. So that's what actually happened, and that's because we were looking at, if you look at the time series, there was sort of a net decline in prices for the year 2022. Now, to understand the sort of net impact, we did a number of scenarios, so averted counterfactuals. So we did an example where there was no Black Sea Grain Initiative. That scenario where you block exports out of Ukraine, export restrictions, and then the LATI international cooperation, where you block exports for Ukraine and block exports in a number of countries. So the concern, again, going back to those historical cases where prices spiked in 2007, 2008, 2010, 2011, that's when we saw cascading trade restrictions from a number of countries around the world. And so when we try to identify, non-ideal or bad scenarios for the food system, we looked at those countries that imposed export restrictions previously, with the assumption that they're more inclined to intervene in their trade, which I think is a reasonable assumption. So with the various scenarios, we would have seen an increase in about 13% for if we didn't have international cooperation, prices would have increased by 13%. So that's one set of counterfactuals. We also did a study to see what policy levers we might have to try and uh, be proactive and to try and, if we deal with a similar situation in the future, uh, are there policy efforts that we might pose? Some of these, yeah, we might have different levels of comfort with them because they are, and some of them are very admittedly top down, um, very top down centralized policies. So, for example, a temporary reduction in feed consumption in the EU were very top down and controversial. But we looked at that to see how prices would respond in the model. We did other uh, counterfactuals where we changed global stocks, changed production of major producers, um, and a whole range of things. And I think this is scenario analysis in a situation where you have a highly uncertain system is probably one of our it's not perfect, but it's one of the tools in our toolboxes. And I think it's one way we can sort of grapple with huge uncertainties. The other, I guess traditionally a way of thinking about this is to try and chain different models together, right? And what we know is that when you try and do that, you have cascading uncertainty. You try and chain a climate model with a crop model, with an economic model, with then a trade model. Yeah, there's uncertainty at each stages, and then this sort of all blows up. So at the end, that's not terribly useful, or it's limited in its use. Uh, Of course, there are uncertainties here, but I think it's a little bit more. I don't know. I think it's more comprehensible, especially when you're trying to work with policymakers and communicate some of the uncertainties. I don't think you gain much. Well, I think the chaining models together could ultimately harm you um, in trying to make decisions when they become too complex and too many uncertainties. We also combine that the price model, this is the trade with storage model from Potsdam, which is this global commodity model, price model with just an estimate um, of inventories at the country level. And again, we looked at counterfactual, so lacking international cooperation, and we computed sort of impaired supply is a supply that was lost but needs to be made up. So that doesn't mean that a country can't make up for that supply, but it's simply a metric of how much the country needs to replace if it was lost by. Uh, in this case, when we lack international cooperation, that means Ukraine's not exporting, and a number of other countries have imposed export restrictions. So when you see the countries in red, these are countries that have impaired supply and that need to make up some of their uh, imports. Then we had computed impaired supply per reserve. So think about reserves are sort of physical buffers to deal with uncertainty. The interesting story behind reserves is um, these sort of having a physical reserve fell out of favor, I think globally, right? And a lot of trends happen globally. Like, for example, when I'm just thinking about an example in water supply, right? There was a big shift towards privatization of water supply. Previously, it was all public sector, and then you had this rapid shift, and globally, that was the in vogue thing to do is to have privatization, and then that failed, and then we had sort of a switch back. Same thing here. Holding of physical food reserves was seen as a waste because you have a high rate of spoilage. And just thinking about climate change and things like that, that might even be a additional pressure if you want to hold a large physical food reserve. However, if you have a scenario where there's a major disruption to production, I think a physical food reserve comes in handy, right? So there's sort of a balancing act there. I remember it was years ago, and where was I? And I ended up I think I was in Maryland, and it was in a taxi with a guy from USDA. He got furious. He like, like screaming at me. He's like, physical food reserve. We don't want to have reserves, physical reserves, because they're a real waste. And it's like, yeah. However, that you don't want to go too far in an extreme. You want to have some balance. You want to have some physical reserves, and whatever the appropriate level is, and that's something we can explore, especially through scenario analysis. So I think we have to avoid the temptation to dismiss different options, especially in these sort of situations where we have high uncertainty. And just to point out, we had a worst case scenario where block Ukraine, we have breadbasket failures and escalating export restrictions. So just getting a handle on these different potential situations is useful, especially in volcanic eruptions. We can't predict volcanic eruptions, right? So that's why we then need to take this different approach. So all of the results I was showing there were with a globally pooled market for wheat, for soy, for maize, individually, but global values. And an exciting work that Killian has done. He just published a paper in Ecological Economics, where the aggregate model, where he's now broken the world up into a number of different regions. I think this is the first stab at it, because what we do know is that depending upon the commodity, you have very different global communities of trade. It looks totally different for soy, for eggs, for milk. So the groupings used here might make sense for wheat, but maybe not for eggs or chicken, or some other food commodity. So that's something that we need to think about. But the nice thing about this model is that it has seasonality. So the other models run at an annual time step. This is run at a bi-weekly time step. They have trade networks built into the model. They have heterogeneity of national storage policy. And so this is something that needs to be worked on it. And this is what led to the other sort of indicator I'm talking about. This includes irrational policy interventions, but I think most of the functions in the model assume some rationality. And I think as we had our workshop earlier today, I forgot the person online was saying that during crisis events, that assumption of rationality breaks down. And we know that empirically from those previous food price crises. So that means a lot of our tools become limited in their value. So I think moving forward, especially for large potential climate disruption events, we have to build on a tool like aggregate and think about decision making, how we deal with decision making in the model for the different actors. The nice thing about aggregate and the previous model is that they have two different types of agents. One is sort of a government strategic agent that's holding reserves for strategic purposes, and then a market responsive agent. So that's a nice way of distinguishing decision making. But I think we need to go farther, and we need to think about how we treat decision making in these models. One of the directions I'm going in for this, and also for modeling migration decision making, if you're familiar with Daniel Kahneman's work on thinking fast and thinking slow, I think a book from 2011, but of course it was his whole career working on these type of questions. I think that might be a very fruitful way of thinking about how governments. So we can think about it at the government level. How does a government respond to a crisis? Does it do a sort of knee-jerk reaction and we're going to impose tariffs, we're going to protect our domestic market, that's what we're doing? Or is it so that's thinking fast, or is it thinking slow, meaning you're more analytical and you're looking at different scenarios, different options, trying to optimize things. I think those specific modes of cognition are a way we can start to get a handle on some of these challenging situations, for modeling very complex systems, but in crisis situations. So for me, I would say, like, yeah, I think there's some promise. This aggregate model's made some nice progress in modeling short-term disruptions. I think next steps are probably to build out or improve our understanding of decision making and how it's represented in these models. So that's sort of the access, right? Like all those models we're trying to get at, price dynamics, um, that result from different scenarios. But for actual production shocks, meaning your shortages, of when food disappears, I think that's where these sort of scenarios where you have a large volcanic eruption, um, the Laki eruption had this sort of large stratospheric injection that disrupted global food systems, widespread crop failure across Europe and out into Asia and Egypt and other places, um, and sort of this haze effect. Sort of is from this is a visualization from The Economist to make it a little bit more uh, um, communicate it a little bit better. But the impact spread throughout Europe is sort of haze, which impacts your ability to grow crops, especially depending upon the timing, and depending upon the base state of your climate system. So we can do studies. I think climate models are useful tools for this. Crop models are useful tools for this to give us some estimates of how our food systems can respond, and then we might want to couple with some of the other, for example, the aggregate model that I just mentioned. A study that Jonas Jagermeyer, I was also on this, from 2020. I think many people are familiar with this. This is trying to look at the scenario of a regional nuclear conflict. Now, there's a important distinction between the particles ejected from a nuclear conflict and those from a volcanic eruption. However, I think these type of studies are in the same family, and I think looking at these studies together are somewhat informative. So I'll just talk about some of the results that we had from this study. Now, I just said about chaining models together. Well, so there was some chaining of a model together here. Well, first there's conflict scenario, so that's the same thing. So where the chaining of models comes in, there are two, one climate model basically, but two scenarios for that climate model that adjusted the injection of soot aerosols. So differences in timing of that injection. And then that was connected with a crop model and then a trade model. So do what I say, but don't say what I do. Well, anyways. Yeah. So we did this, but I don't think we did a full sort of sensitivity study, but I think just getting a flavor in this case, right? You're just trying to get an order of magnitude. What is the order of magnitude impact of nuclear conflict on temperatures and crop production? And then you can sort of do some estimate, which is kind of what we did. Sort of, I don't know. I wouldn't characterize it any more than a sort of a back of the envelope, a glorified back of the envelope calculation of what the impact on supply around the world would be. But it gives us some order of magnitude. So from the climate model, the two different scenarios, we had temperature changes 0 to 15 years after the conflict, precipitation changes, and anybody who works with climate models knows that the skill of climate models and precipitation is questionable. However, we see a general decline in precipitation, changes in shortwave radiation and long-wave radiation. Um, and these are inputs into your crop models. Uh, this is just an example of the maize yield response from a number of crop models. So these are globally gridded crop models. And globally gridded crop models, if you ever come across a crop model, the first thing you should know is there's a lot of uncertainty with their estimates of yield and production, and the reason is a lot of reasons. I mean, soils vary significantly from location to location. Crops are different; they're not uniform. Uh, Trying to parameterize these models is very difficult. There's a lot of factors that make crop models very uncertain. Um, but again, we're trying to get sort of order of magnitude estimate. So here we see in the red, you see the northern hemisphere experiencing some of the largest yield changes. This is for maize, uh, notably China, parts of China, also parts of North America. This is very year where some of the main um, maize producing region in the United States is. So there was sort of a clear negative yield response. Again, this is over time. So these different subplots are 0 to 15 years. So clear yield response declines. Wheat is not so much a clear story. You see in the gray so it's maize, wheat, rice, soy. The gray latitude um, it indicates the fraction of global crop land by latitude. Um, so the yield decline is notably larger for maize compared to wheat. And the same thing with simulations of climate change or future climate change. Wheat is this it's not as clear decline in wheat productivity or yields compared to something like maize. Um, Now rice is interesting, right? You see the main distribution is in the lower latitudes, but the largest yields decline are in the upper latitudes where actually there's not much rice. So um, rice in this scenario is not so critical. Soy is somewhere in between. Probably the bigger story is with maize. Um, and so that was estimating the yield and impacts, and then we tried to just get a sense of what the country level changes in wheat and maize stocks would be. Uh, so this is the pre-conflict. This is the stocks to use ratio. So basically a high ratio, it means you have a lot of stocks compared to your use. So that's good. Well, good unless you're concerned about food waste. Low ratio means you're vulnerable to supply disruptions. Um, and so we see sort of uh, the stocks to use ratio. You see this is the baseline. We see significant declines and sort of depletion by year 4 of stocks globally. And these are the changes associated with that. So clearly, there's a role for stocks to buffer disruptions for a very large event like this. We don't have sufficient global reserves to deal with this. I think it's a reasonable argument to say, well, we don't want to have huge reserves to deal with this type of situation. But I think we have to think about other pathways. Reserves are only part of the our toolkit for dealing with these types of situations. But to try and answer those questions, well, what are our strategies? How large should food reserves be? that's why it's important to do these type of studies. And it's notable is that this scenario was, heavily focused. That the most of the impacts are in the northern hemisphere. So when we think about volcanic eruptions, we were talking about today in the workshop, depends upon the location, the timing. Is it is it El Nino year, a La Nina year? All of those things influence whether or not the volcanic eruption will have an impact on food supply. Again, just to note that the dynamics for a nuclear situation are the particles ejected to the atmosphere are much more longer lasting, and they have different dynamics. So it is more severe. So we don't want any nuclear conflict, even a regional nuclear conflict. And I guess that's at least a little bit comforting that the volcanic eruptions aren't as severe unless it's a really huge eruption. But these are different related type situations that help us narrow in on, well, first, what are the various situations, the scenarios we would deal with? What are our potential strategies for mitigating the impact? Going back to the Badger economics statement, look, we have a lot of policy levers, we have coordination, we have ability to anticipate some of the responses, and we know what doesn't work, what works. So I think that's I mean, that's where the hope is, right? There is opportunity for making the situation better. I mentioned we're doing some work right now. And I guess just briefly, the starting point was we were trying to use some of the mathematics from quantum mechanics to help with decision making. And so we made a little bit of progress, but then I said, well, we need some empirical data. So I was working with a colleague in Florida and a research assistant, and he said, well, let's look at the stocks data, right? Because stocks have a very high frequent data, and if there's any sort of interesting behavior, we should see it there in the stocks data. And so it was interesting. We started to look at some of the stocks data, and one of the things there's been some work to try and understand correlations in the stock market that are more than what you would say, what traditional metrics would say. So meaning that the correlations are just stronger than you would expect by classical models. So like you say, how much do stocks move together? It might be a typical question they would ask. But the classical models miss a situation where correlations become so strong that they're sort of violating some of our core assumptions. And so the student went up and he computed some statistics, and we're like, oh yeah, we think we can use this Bell test. It's a metric to see if there's sort of a quantum-like entanglement. So with quantum particles, that they're entangled, they're moving together more than you would expect classically. We're not saying there's quantum behavior here, but we're saying there's quantum-like behavior, meaning that the correlations are just stronger than we expect, that something is violating our normal statistic boundaries. And so we thought, well, let's start to look at some of the stuff in the food system to see if we see some signals. So basically, we're using a quantum-inspired metric to measure correlation strength. And we're saying, well, do we find correlations that are stronger than what classical statistics predict? Should be possible. And so mathematical, there's a sort of this S1 violation, or it's sort of an estimate of, if you have an S1 violation, that means correlation is not following classical expectation. And so we did some calculations with our model. We found these violations. We're like, oh wow, we got something here. And then we found this paper from this year, and they actually did something similar with the stock markets. The S&P 500 stock, and they found uh, that using this S1 violation, it detected stock market crises a little bit better than some of the traditional metrics. And so you can think of it like um, yeah, I guess normally you expect, especially in a given sector, you expect uh, prices to move together, but across sectors you might not expect them to move so closely. What we find with these S1 violations is that um, that the prices of the stocks are moving together more than we would expect, and in particular, it looks like this is just two agriculture related stocks. It looks like, so the violation is when you're above this 2.0 value. We're seeing frequent violations. Now, we were just discussing this and I said, well, we need to know what the baseline situation is and then look at crisis periods. So here we look at the COVID and the Ukraine war, and seeing if those situations have greater violations than the normal non-crisis periods. And in fact, it looks like during the COVID period, we have higher rates of violation. So I think this is very important because this means that if you have a breakdown in market independence during crises, it's going to amplify the impacts of a crisis. So if companies are ending up making the same decision or impacted the same way, much more so than you would expect, it'll really amplify impacts globally. So we have some thoughts on why this may be the case. Sometimes we're actually going back to look at general stock and like technology stocks of various sectors to see the response in those sectors. But one of our thinking is a lot of the trading is done is automated algorithms, and they're very similar algorithms across different fund managers and whatnot. So because of that situation, there's sort of a unexpected coordination across various actors in response to a same event. So if there's a crisis event, all of these automated algorithms might be behaving in the same way, sort of amplifying the impacts that you wouldn't expect everything, all these trading companies to be acting in the same way. So this is, again, preliminary, but I think it's a type of metric that can be helpful. Just a practical question: what does that mean for building resilience? Well, if we can develop out that sort of metric, it serves as somewhat of an early warning indicator in some cases. It also changes our expectation of what will happen during a crisis event. And if there's more coordination across the agricultural sector or spillover between the agricultural sector and the financial sector, agriculture and tech, this means that these crisis situations can be amplified. So this is important to consider. Sort of a classical figure that we see. This is a system performance on the y-axis, and then sort of the time axis here. So if we're thinking about after a volcanic shock, well, before we have a planet stage, then you have the disruption, your system performance declines, and you sort of absorb what happens, and then you have a recovery phase. The goal here is to minimize this sort of decline in system performance. But if you reach a point where the system performance declines so much, then you can ultimately end up in failure and you don't recover. So this is I think the criticism of this is, oh, it's such a generic figure, but I like it because it is a nice sort of framing to understand resilience and failure, and get a robust system. Would it have any decline system performance? Um, if you have resilience, you're able to recover. So, you know, volcanic eruptions can be large enough. It's so large that we're not going to be in this robust where system performance doesn't stay as constant. But if we can minimize this dip, then we're in a better situation. And I guess this is sort of the anti-fragile, right? Like if you improve, if you're hit with variability, then you improve. That's sort of anti-fragile behavior from Taleb's book. Uh, yeah. So I guess just to summarize, um, so food shocks are ever present threat, and this is a characteristic of our food system, and it's just with or without climate change. This is a characteristic of our climate system and our food systems, and so it's insufficient just to have these reactive approaches. We want to build out some sort of early warning capabilities. We want to understand the dynamics better. Uh, I think it's important to understand the different strategic actors in our food system. We see the Ukraine war. It's not this sort of rational, cooperative relationship. We have the U.S. with its objective. We have Brazil with its objectives. We have China with its objective. Russia. Each country has its own national interest. It's a strategic environment. It's a competitive environment. Uh, and so we have to build our tools that we can properly capture that. And their behaviors change depending upon if you have crisis situations versus normal, sort of more stable situations. So these are sort of the characteristics of our systems that we're striving to capture. If we build out better tools for that, it also sort of helps us with our early warning indicators, and then ultimately informing our policies. And I would lastly add that I think there's a lot of loud voices talking about transforming climate systems to be resilient to climate change, to have less impact on the climate system, and that's all fine and good. But you can't do that in a narrow view. You have to do that in its broader context where we understand the actual workings of our food system, how it's a strategic, competitive environment, and very, very complex. So building appropriate tools is the way forward.